Finding the absolute maximum and absolute minimum on the given interval. What you must do. First, determine if the function is continuous. If the function is continuous, then a maximum and a minimum exist on the interval. Then, find all critical points of the function that are in the interval. Then, evaluate the function at the critical points found. Lastly, we identified the absolute maximum and absolute minimum. How do we do this? First, we determine if the function is continuous in the interval AB. To do this, we look at the domain. If there exists a real number that makes the expression undefined, then the function is not continuous. Once we determine if the function is continuous, we move on to finding the critical points. To do that, we must differentiate f of x. Once we get the derivative of f of x, we make it equal to 0 and we solve for the critical points. Lastly, we input the endpoints and the critical points into f of x to find the absolute maximum and absolute minimum. Let's look at an example. Find the absolute maximum and absolute minimum values of the following function. F of x equals x to the power of 3 minus 3x squared minus 1 over the interval negative 3, 4. First thing we have to do is find out if f of x is continuous. Let's look at the domains. There does not exist a number that make f of x undefined, therefore f of x is continuous. Number 2, finding the critical points. Now that we have determined if f of x is continuous, we move on to getting the critical points. We differentiate f of x and we get 3x squared minus 6x. We make that equal to 0 and we solve for x. And our x values are 0 and 2. Now, let's go back to the interval. Our interval is negative 3, 4. Does 0 and 2 fall in between those numbers? Yes, they do. Therefore, we could use them as critical points. Number 3, evaluate f of x at the endpoints and critical points. We input our endpoints and our critical points into the original f of x and check what value is the highest and what value is the smallest. Once we input negative 3 into f of x, we get negative 55. And when we input 4 into f of x, we get 15. And when we input 0 into f of x, we get negative 1. And when we input 2 into f of x, we get negative 5. And by checking out the outputs, we could figure out which one is the absolute maximum and the absolute minimum. And in this case, our absolute maximum is going to be at x equals 4, which is 15. And our absolute minimum is at x equals negative 3, which is negative 55.